To most of the rugby world, the history of Georgian rugby looks a bit like this. When in fact, the history of Georgian rugby is far more interesting. Georgia are one of only 5 countries in the world who consider 15-a-side rugby their national sport. And, with the World Cup now less than 1 year away, now is the prime time to dive into the years of circumstance that brought rugby to the forefront of Georgian sporting culture and explore the years of history that feed into every scrum, maul and sin binning for Victor Kolyashvili. Whilst Kolyashvili might be Georgia's current token brickard beardy shithouse, he comes from a proud heritage that dates back literally thousands of years. Today, the Georgian word for try is Lelo. Whilst France and Argentina use translations of the word attempt, Georgia's equivalent has a far more violent history. Instead, Lelo comes from the name of a sport native to Georgia, which is believed to be about 8,000 years old, which makes it about 4,000 years older than Nis and the Feywa. The earliest recorded mention of the sport comes in The Knight in Panther's Skin, a refreshingly liberal masterpiece of 12th century Georgian epic poetry, which I'm assured is a competitive field and one Marutoshi is looking to break into. That fact isn't really relevant, but I did spend 4 hours reading the poem in the hope it might give me some insight into why the Georgians are so good at scrummaging, and it didn't, so the least you can do is suffer through 30 seconds of me talking about it. Lelo is essentially what would happen if rugby had a midlife crisis. The idea is still 2 teams compete to get the ball from one end to the other over a line defended by the opposition team. But every other rule has gone out the window. The ball weighs approximately 20 kilograms, which is equivalent to 38 rugby balls or 2 Matthew Morgans. There was no upper limit on the number of players involved, and the homoerotic tickle we now know as a rugby tackle is replaced by full-on violent assault. The kind that were to take place outside of Wetherspoons would equal 6 months in the slammer or an average Thursday night in Nottingham. Weapons weren't allowed, but if you found a rock, you were well within your rights to twat the ball carrier in the face with it. Oh, and the pitch, yeah, that's a mile long. In the name of tradition, Georgia still plays Lelo once a year, with only slightly sanitised rules. Last year, during the game, 2 people died. That's 2 people dead. And World Rugby worries so much about high tackles being a concern. In Lelo, it wasn't against the rules to actually murder someone. It was against the law, sure, but there was no punishment in-game, and it would actually help your side win. So really, your prison sentence would just be taking one for the team. Over the years, Georgia began to realise that Lelo was insane, and in the interest of retaining life and limbs, the sport began to morph into what's referred to as standardised Lelo, the rules of which sound kind of familiar. The pitch is now only 100 metres long, each team has 15 players, and you can now only smack the ball carrier, and not even him with a rock. Honestly, the game's gone soft. Where it differs from rugby is the ability to pass forward, and the fact the ball carrier couldn't carry the ball for more than 10 seconds, likely to recreate the fact that in a traditional game, if you kept the ball for any longer than this, you'd lose a knee. Basically, it was that rugby netball game everyone hates playing in training, crossed with a prison brawl. Over a decade or two, this all but replaced traditional Lelo in Georgia, the whole country now playing a game very similar to rugby. Fast forward to the 1930s, and with the country now under Soviet control, Anatoly Lunacharsky, a writer, Marxist and rugby fan, which incidentally is how I describe my ideal woman, comes to visit Georgia. Upon seeing Lelo, he begins to think the Georgians may be perfect for a particular other sport, and he decides he should be the one to introduce it to them. But they're not keen on tennis, so they go back to play. No, I'm joking. It's rugby. He tries to introduce them to rugby. But then, before he can have any success getting rugby to take foot, he dies. Whilst on a trip to France as well, which is just insult to injury. Except actually, it was kind of lucky for him because he was beginning to piss off Joseph Stalin, a man for bloodlust only since matched by the Leicester Tigers board. And he died, thankfully, just days before the big man would have had him offed. But unfortunately, before he could really get rugby to permeate in Georgia. So, it's now 1949, and rugby in Georgia is no more than a footnote in a foreign language, when a French schoolteacher by the name of Jacques Haspecan makes exactly the same realisation. The Georgians would be perfect for rugby. Following this, the game spread throughout Georgia over the next 15 years, leading to the creation of the Georgian Rugby Federation in 1963, and Georgia played their first test match in 1991, just a year after they were declared independent from the Soviet Union, following a referendum in which 99% of the country voted for independence. Which, if you ask me, is the kind of result you'd want to see in a referendum in order to be certain an act of major national upheaval is genuinely in people's interest. It took Georgia just 11 years from their first ever game to World Cup qualification for 2003. a record. In 2007, they almost beat Ireland. In 2011, they introduced the world to Mamuka Gogodze, their first truly world-class player. And in 2016, he was forced to retire from international rugby after the UN classified him as a weapon of mass destruction that could potentially endanger entire populations if allowed to roam free. These days, he only wanders France, which the UN obviously didn't have a problem with. And now, in 2018, Georgia sit alongside Fiji and Japan in a weird bubble. They're not yet good enough to beat the big boys, but they're so much better than the sides below them. And yet, with a fixture against Italy coming up this autumn, Georgia have a chance to try and prove they're good enough to get a shot at the Six Nations. Heading into that game and the World Cup, Georgia's main strength is their strength, namely their scrummaging. It's rare to be able to use superlatives about any team other than New Zealand, but Georgia possibly do have the best scrum in the world. They seem to produce endless quantities of quality and sizable front row forwards, with more than 30 Georgian props currently playing pro rugby in France alone. However, the real reason to keep an eye on this Georgian pack is because someone is keeping an eye on them. You'd be forgiven for missing him as you glance at the lineup, but since Gogodze failed his nuclear waste assessment, Georgia's key man has been someone considerably less ginormous. This man is Vasil Lobenitsa. Named in the 2015 World Cup squad as an uncapped 17-year-old, Lil Lobby proved himself right away, coordinating a superb tactical display that saw Georgia upset favourites Tonga in their opening game. Lobenitsa is quick and has a keen eye for a gap, but where he differs from most second-tier halfbacks is in his understanding of the game. Because rugby either doesn't have the foothold or the funding in their country, often Tier 2 9s and 10s aren't exposed to making split-second tactical decisions at a high standard from an early enough age, which means they're going to struggle to manage a game when they reach the top table. Players like Arj McGinty and Khan Fotawali are the exceptions that prove the rule, growing up in a country where rugby is far more prominent or well-funded and well-coached. But Lobenitsa grew up in a country where rugby is in the blood, admittedly blood spilled by his grandfather on the side of a Lolo field. Lobenitsa is just as useful in a game of rugby as his name is in a game of Scrabble. At only 21 years of age, he's amassed 36 caps and is continuing to improve all the time. He's very much the first product of rugby's popularity in Georgia and living proof the side could yet reach Tier 1. The one problem Lobenitsa runs into, however, is how limited this Georgian team actually are. Good in the scrum and the maul and on the pick and goal, but behind the scrum, they are kind of limited. Whilst coach Milton Haig makes a show of his attempts to grow Georgia into an attacking team, and there have been some improvements, they're still some way behind even contemporaries Japan and Fiji. What flair they do show tends to come from talent of individuals, such as jack of all trades centre Merab Surakadze, live wire wing Soso Matiashvili, and Merab Kurakashvili, a man who I consider to be virtually perfect. However, I do want to draw attention to one particular position. While selecting most backs positions for Georgia is a nightmare, the 13 shirt is undoubtedly the nightmare. As in, for the last 14 years, that shirt has belonged to Davit Kasharava, a man affectionately known by the nickname The Nightmare. Why? Because he's an absolute nightmare to play against. Whilst he's perhaps never set the game alight in attack, Kasharava is as good a defensive 13 as you'll find. Not only an excellent tackler, but he's an expert at closing down space the opposition may find. Such is his prowess, he's become a roadblock teams know they need to work around. In their encounter a couple of years ago, Scotland would constantly send first phase ball down his channel, making him tackle, meaning he was on the ground out the game, so they could exploit the space he was no longer able to close. By keeping Kasharava quiet, it allowed teams to exploit the semi-pro nature of most of this Georgian team. Their fitness isn't the same, they aren't as quick, and they won't know their systems as well as those teams that have trained together every day for years. So, how do you beat Georgia? You match them up front, you close down Lobenitsa, and you don't let Kasharava close you down. But how does Georgia beat you? You know that old adage about forwards winning matches but backs decided by how much? You've just got to hope their backs didn't remember to tie their laces because they have a pack that can win matches. And finally, 1 year out, can Georgia win the Rugby World Cup? No, they absolutely can't. But if all the Tier 1 nations suddenly died in an accident involving a nuclear Gogodze, I'd fancy Georgia. A World Cup is a long, tiring campaign, and it helps have an endless dungeon of big scrummage monsters to fall back on. This side has an upset or two in them, and their clash with Fiji next year could be one of the most exciting games of the whole World Cup. As such, whilst next year may not redefine Georgia to the rugby world as the glorious, victorious world champions, it may yet show itself as the year a country with a fascinating history finally put its brutality to good use. Before I get into any of the usual nonsense, I just want to finish by dedicating the video to Mamuka, who was a 25-year-old who lost his life immediately following the last game of full-on Lalo Georgia had in a car accident, who I came across whilst researching the game. And I just want to send my best regards to his family and his friends, because it's awful what happened. Otherwise, this video has been the second part of a series I want to do on how teams are looking ahead to the World Cup next year. So if you keep an eye out for those, this is the France video so far, for being just 1 year away. And beyond that, I want to say thank you to Rugby Warfare for continuing to sponsor the channel, SQ20 for 20% off, and the disguise floating somewhere around here, I can't see it. And then thank you to all the Patreons for continuing to support the channel. There's all kinds of stuff coming up as well. I'm working on some more stuff for you guys. And thank you to you for watching. And also thank you to Ollie and Jack from Long Eaton RFC for this.
Squidge Rugby!